I'm a park ranger stationed in the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. I've been doing the job for the better part of a decade and was with the US Forest Service before that. It's safe to say that I know my way around the mountains and have seen everything there is to see. At least, I thought so. We have remote satellite stations scattered throughout the more wilderness areas of the park. They don't appear on any park maps, and the other rangers don't usually talk about them. We've had instances of vandalism, and fugitives have even taken up residence within them on multiple occasions. They serve as a form of emergency station, and sometimes personnel from various government agencies use them for extended research projects. Most of them are relatively easy to reach, but a few of them require several days' hike on foot. Every so often, we're directed to check on some of the more remote locations, just to check on supplies, building integrity, things like that. And that's what I found myself doing a few months ago. I was asked to go to the most distant station of them all, half a day's ride on an ATV, plus 2 days on foot, one way. So I brought a fair amount of gear with me. From what I understood, nobody had been there for 6 months, but a recent flyby from one of our helicopters thought they saw a wisp of smoke in the vicinity of the shelter. It's basically on the side of a mountain, so there's no way the helicopter could land anywhere close by. So I packed up my stuff and headed out on a clear, warm morning. The ride was easy and I made good time. When I came to the point I would need to leave my ATV, I locked it in a small hut used just for that purpose. Then I began my 2-day journey on foot up the mountain path. It was late in the evening of the first day when I had my first experience. It was going to be dark soon, and I was looking for a good place to spend the night with a source of fresh water. Eventually I came upon a mountain stream and followed it up ways until I reached a clearing where I could pitch my tent. Except I found something in the clearing. It was the carcass of a full-grown bull elk. It was fresh, probably less than a day old. The bizarre part was the pair of arrows sticking out from its rump. I've seen things like these in the history books, stone-tipped heads lashed to a stick of shaved woods with some kind of thin fiber. I'm not a hunter, but I know a bunch of them, and I've seen the gear they use. These arrows didn't come from any kind of modern-day bow that I knew of. I've heard of people who took up primitive-style hunting, but I didn't think anyone came all the way out here to do it. There wasn't anyone around and there wasn't much I could do about it. I didn't want to stay near the elk in case any nighttime scavengers or predators came along. So I continued another half-mile and spent a comfortable night under the stars. The next day I got up and continued on. The trail became a little more difficult to traverse at this point, but I still hoped to reach the station before nightfall. I can't explain it, but for most of the morning, I had a weird feeling that I was being watched. Only by what, I didn't know. I found out just after lunch. I had stopped to boil up a freeze-dried meal I had brought. The aroma of teriyaki chicken cut sharply through the scent of the fresh pine trees all around. I was just about to take my first bite when a rustle from a nearby bush and a blur of movement caught my attention. I turned quickly thinking it was an animal, and instead came face to face with a man, if that's what it can even be called. It was about 5 feet tall and had a mane of coarse hair across most of its face. It had a tan complexion and a thick brow over its eyes, twice the size of mine. Held tightly in its left hand was a long shaft of wood ending in a stone tip, exactly like the one I had seen on the arrow the day before. They each wore garments made from what looked like deerskin. We froze, staring at each other for several moments, until 2 more similar creatures emerged from behind nearby trees. One held another spear, and the other appeared to be a woman carrying a deerskin sack over her shoulder. They didn't advance any further, and I wasn't sure what to do. I placed my bag of teriyaki on the ground and slowly started pacing back. When I had gone about 20 steps, the woman, hunched forward, loped over to the bag of food I had left and snatched it off the ground. She smelled it a few times, then scooped a hairy handful from the bag, shoving it into her mouth. She let out an excited yelp and jumped up and down a few times. She rushed over to one of the men and handed him the bag. The scenario began playing out again, and then finishing with the third man. The woman turned back to me and let out a string of guttural noises, none of which I understood. I simply stood still, arms raised in the air, palms facing outward. I didn't know what to do. I had my service pistol, but it was in the satchel that I had left sitting next to where I was boiling the food. One of the other men started speaking in that same harsh language. When I didn't respond, he gripped his spear with the other hand and stepped forward a few feet. I was preparing to make a run for it when from the forest behind them came at least a half a dozen calls spoken in that same strange language. They looked at each other and then at me. The two men turned and ran into the forest behind them. The woman stood staring at me for a few moments longer, then dashed forward, grabbed my satchel, and took off into the forest after her friends. I turned and headed back the other way, running until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I had no choice but to give up the journey to the station. I had no supplies, and besides, I didn't really want to run into those things again. I had a lot of time to think on the way back and decided that I was going to lie. Nobody back at the ranger station was going to believe me. I'm not even sure I believed myself. I told my supervisor that I was driven off by a mother black bear and that I lost all my gear in the process, which made me the laughingstock of all the rangers and earned me the nickname Bear Boy. They ended up pushing the job off for another month and said they're going to send another ranger. I can't explain what or who those things were. Of course I have heard of Neanderthals and cavemen, but they've been extinct for 200,000 years, right? I'm coming to you from upstate Massachusetts. I've had an ongoing experience over the past couple months that I think is right up your alley. I'm a gardener, and due to the area I live in, I usually work for some very rich people. I usually work for the same estate or mansion for as long as they'll have me. It's more predictable than you'd think, honestly. My last job before this one lasted 8 years, but my boss moved down south and sold off his mansion. I got fired during the off-season, so no one was really hiring. When I found a job at a new estate, I honestly felt pretty lucky. When I first got hired, I was told that the only people who lived at the estate were a couple in their 30s. The home had been passed down on the husband's side, and it was plopped in the middle of nowhere. They couldn't rent it out because it was too far from the ocean or any attractions. They didn't have any pets or kids. It was just the couple, Mr. and Mrs. Davis, and us staff members. The first problem was that they didn't have enough staff for the place. The Davises' garden was big enough that it could have used 5 gardeners for the upkeep, but they'd only hired 2 of us. Normally I would have taken that as a red flag, but like I said, I needed the money. I started in the fall, so I was thrown headfirst into the planting season. I spent most of those first few weeks just getting rid of dead trees that had overtaken the place. It's normal for a landscaper to miss a tree or two, but it's like the whole garden had died. The garden hadn't been properly taken care of in years. A lot of the estate was like that too. Some areas of the house had been straight up abandoned. We had our staff quarters out back, and those were fine. But the rest of it? Half of the rooms in the main house looked like they hadn't been touched for decades. One night I asked the chef about it since he'd been on the staff the longest. I thought maybe the house had been someone's 3rd or 4th home and they stopped caring about it because no one actually lived there. But he said the house has been the main home for Mr. Davis' family since he'd been born. Things didn't start going downhill until about 6 months before I was hired. Most of the staff assumed that the money was running out. That was the easiest way to explain such a drastic shift. I believed that explanation too. Until one night, I stayed out in the garden after dark. I wanted to finish building some plant beds so that I could be done for the week. That way I could spend a few days in the nearest town and see if there was any last-minute work there. I was by myself at the back of the gardens, and I was working right at the edge of the forest line. My flashlight died. Before I could head for the house, I felt someone pressing down on my shoulder. A blast of cold air rushed through me. It was so frigid that it gave me the shakes. I heard a pair of footsteps walking away from me, toward the main house. Now it was dark out, but between the moon and the lights from the mansion, I could see a little bit. And I knew there was no one out there except me. But I could hear those footsteps. It was unmistakable. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I grabbed my tools and headed back to the staff quarters as fast as I could. I was trying not to make a big deal out of it, but I was shaken up. I knew what I felt. That was only the first time I felt the presence of something else. Over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Something happened every couple of days. I started keeping a journal to record my experience, just so I would know I wasn't crazy. Usually I would be working in the garden or alone in the kitchen, but it didn't really matter. The pattern was the same. The nearest light source would go out. I'd feel someone touching me, like my elbow or a pat on the back, as if they were asking me to move over. Then, a blast of cold. It felt like instant hypothermia. After the fourth or fifth time, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked the other gardener, Jeff, if anything weird had happened to him. At first, he laughed it off like nothing was wrong. I thought maybe I was the only one. But the next time it happened, we were together, and he felt it too. Apparently this thing had been freaking Jeff out at the same time it started visiting me. He just didn't want me to think he was crazy. I asked the other staff members and tried to be discreet about it. 2 of the housekeepers plus the chef also felt that strange presence. We started working in pairs to make sure no one was ever alone. We didn't know what this thing was or what it could do, after all. It slowed down everyone's productivity, but the Davises either didn't notice or didn't care. One of the housekeepers found a new job and booked it out of there. The rest of us are only sticking it out because we don't have anywhere else to go. It's not like the presence or spirit or whatever it is has really tried to hurt us. But Jeff thinks that if it's a ghost, it's only a matter of time before things escalate. We'll see. I'm trying to find work before the new year because I don't know how much longer I can take this. If things do get worse, or if the spirit becomes more active, I'll call you back in to let you know. I hope it doesn't come to that. I work at this summer home community in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Best I can describe it, it's a nice neighborhood that's kind of like a resort with a swimming pool, golf, hiking trails, spa, and a clubhouse. It's the opposite of a snowbird community because it's completely inaccessible in the winter due to the snow in the mountains. That's where I come in. I work there during the summer when all the residents are around, but I'm the only one who stays through the winter, basically making sure the place isn't ransacked when no one else is there. I live in a small house, and I don't do much except wander around in my pickup with the snowplow attachment, just making my presence known. I bring up supplies for the whole winter and just stay from October until April or so, alone. It's not as bad as it sounds, since the satellite TV and internet work pretty well. I can communicate with the outside world. I just really can't get anything during those months, so I have to plan in advance. I got a big chest freezer, but I also eat a lot of canned food. I do what I can, but it does all taste pretty much canned. My first winter up there was really quiet. Nothing much happened. I watched a lot of TV and ate a lot of chili and chips. This past winter, though, something odd happened. I usually try to walk around the neighborhood at least once a day. Not just because of my job, but I also go nuts in the house all day. Unless it's a snowstorm, of course. One of my first days I was there, I went out. It hadn't snowed yet since it was just October, but everyone was gone since you never really know when the snow might come. They go ahead and close the community just in case. I still had a few winterizing things to do, like drain the pool. I headed down to the pool to do that, walking just for the exercise. I started working on the pool when I heard this strange noise coming from the nearby woods. The community itself is all groomed and landscaped, but the woods really isn't that far away. It is the mountains, after all. So a few yards beyond the grassy area next to the pool was the forest, basically. The noise was like nothing I'd ever heard, something between a yell and a yodel. Not really scary, but strange. I was partway through draining the pool, so I couldn't really stop. I just watched the woods to see if I could get a look at whatever it was, but I didn't see anything. Just that odd sound. A few weeks later, the first snow came. I stayed inside because I couldn't afford to get lost, being on my own and everything. The next day it was sunny, and I decided to go ahead and plow the roads around the neighborhood. I learned by trial and error that if I let the plowing go too long, it would be almost impossible to do it when it snowed again. The snow gets deep and packed in then, which wouldn't be a big deal since no one else was up there, but I couldn't really do my job if I couldn't go around checking on everything. I started up the truck in late morning and started driving around, plowing the few roads that snake around the 100 or so homes in the community. While I was plowing, I saw some tracks in the snow off the road. I'd seen tracks from coyotes, deer, even bear, but these tracks were bigger. I couldn't see what they were, though, and I didn't bother to get out of the truck to get a look. I didn't think much more about the tracks until one evening, when I was walking on a newly plowed road. It was just beginning to get dark, and I thought I should head back. As I turned around, I glanced toward the woods and saw something walking just outside the trees. At first I thought it was a person, and I was scared. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. There wasn't any reason for anyone to be here, and if they were here, they had to have hiked or come in by helicopter. You can't use those mountain roads in winter, which is exactly why we closed the neighborhood. As I stared at it, though, I could see it was too big and hairy to be a person. It was covered with hair or fur or something. But it wasn't an ape because it walked upright. Also, it was pretty far away, but I thought it was taller than a person, maybe 8 or 9 feet. I remembered the tracks then and wished I had taken a picture of them. I was scared, but then I started to think that it must have been around for a while, and it hadn't hurt me, so why would it now? A few days later, I saw some tracks outside my house. This time, I did take a look at them, and saw they looked like bare human feet, only really big, like size 25 shoes maybe, I don't know. Right on my doorstep was a dead fish. At first I was scared. This thing comes right up to my house and leaves me a dead fish? But then I started to think maybe it was a gift, because it was fresh, and that creature must have gone to some trouble to get it since the lakes and streams were iced over. I took it inside and cooked it, and it was the best thing I'd eaten since fall. A few days later, it brought me a rabbit. That was a little gross, but what the heck. I found a video online on how to clean it and ate that too. It kept bringing me things all winter. Not every day, but every few days. And weirdly, I felt less alone. Once spring came, I didn't see any evidence of it anymore. It felt kind of lonely thinking it was gone. But I bet it'll be back this winter.